to be in the name of the living God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. So if I could, first of all, thank the Rector for his very kind invitation to preach in this beautiful and truly remarkable church on this special occasion. There are very, very few parishes in Ireland that can celebrate 800 years in one building. And of course, if I could also thank not only thank the Bishop of Cork, Cloyne and Ross for allowing me to trespass into his diocese, but also for the very generous hospitality which he and Susan have afforded me. And it's really only on occasions like this that the second part of that ecclesiastical title, which I hold as Primate of all Ireland, has any real meaning. Meaning lies in the building up of relationships through personal encounter and worship across this island. And I'm very grateful for the warmth of the hospitality. And if I could also thank the opportunity of meeting some people yesterday who were truly impressive. Those, for instance, the Friends of Cloyne Cathedral who I had a bit of time to chat to in the cathedral yesterday. And those remarkable people who in Mitchellstown have been working so hard in Kingston College to make it fit for receiving refugees from the Ukraine, whose stories would break your heart and then they warm your heart again by their thankfulness and by all of the work that has been done. And it's a truly impressive tribute. It's a work of God in this place, and it certainly warmed my heart to see it. From this very significantly high vantage point, I can tell that you are a discerning, knowledgeable, and well-travelled congregation. And now that we're allowed to do so again, I have no doubt that many of you have been enjoying the delights of European holidays. And as anyone who travels in Europe will know, even in tiny towns in places like Italy or Austria or France, when you come into the centre, you'll find almost always a medieval church. You'll find perhaps a Renaissance market house, a Rococo town hall. Europe, although it's had its own violent convulsions, has enjoyed very long periods of prosperity and peace, which have resulted all over Europe in what we now call rather prosaically very fine built heritage. Of course, that hasn't been the case in Ireland for all sorts of reasons, to do with colonialism, but also to do with our very profound lust for internecine feuding. In this part of the world, the Geraldine. In the part of the world I come, the O'Neills, very often just fighting other O'Neills, not even fighting their enemies, but their brothers. And that has meant that in most of Ireland, there aren't buildings of this sort left standing. They weren't up for long enough. Someone came and burnt them down before they were allowed to, as it were, bed in. And for that reason, we particularly treasure a place like this, which tells by its stones and by its decoration a more or less continuous tale of development and vicissitudes. But above all, we treasure it because of the 800 years of worship and witness to the goodness and to the beauty of God, which have sounded within its walls. By and large, in the history of the Church of Ireland, there have been four ways through which churches were built and maintained: through private patronage, through central church subvention, through state intervention, and finally through the generosity of worshippers, which tends to be the case today. And as you would expect in a building of this age, all of those processes and all of those benefactors have played a part. And in a sense, it's probably unique also in that way, that it has been supported in all sorts of ways down those 800 years. And we are very, very fortunate that a Church of Ireland clergyman of the 19th century spent a huge amount of his time. Clergymen didn't have a whole lot to do in the 19th century. He spent a huge amount of his time compiling histories, succession lists as they're called, of the parishes in the Diocese of Cloyne, a man called Rev'd. And they are lovely little histories very often of the time that he was writing about. And we're very fortunate to have them because the sources that he used were largely, they largely perished in the conflagration at the Four Courts in 1922, lost forever. But they're captured in some of the writings of people like Rev'd. And we know, for instance, that what was called the advowson, that is the right to appoint the rector or the warden of this place, was in the hands of the king in 1389. And so it was the unfortunate Richard II, who Shakespeare had sitting on the ground talking to the deaf kings, who chose some of your early clergy. But this place was very lucrative, and it was very prestigious right from the beginning. And the very first person to hold the office here was William of Carlisle, who was also the second Baron of the Exchequer in Ireland. Extremely important functionary at that time in Ireland. And indeed, this living was so lucrative that it was held what's called in commendam, that is at the same time, by the bishops of Cloyne. From 1638 to 1838, the bishops of Cloyne, as the bishop will know, were notoriously poor men. You know too, from the timeline that's printed in the front of the Order of Service, that the 8th Earl of Desmond had great ambitions for making Youghal into a university town. And he appointed 8 fellows, and 8 choristers, and a warden to try to develop a university in this place. And they employed 2 chantry priests to sing masses for the repose of his soul. If you skip forward by a century, you read of a man called Baxter, who was the warden of this place, one of the early wardens. And it says in Rev'd's history that on the 25th of May, 1592, he composed for the first fruits and tenths. He composed for the first fruits and tenths. In the medieval church, a priest, on being presented to a parish, was supposed to give the whole of his first year's stipend and a tenth of every following year into the central church, into Rome. Very few did it. They were able to negotiate to reduce it very considerably, or to compose about it, so that they didn't have to give it all in. But in 1592, long after the Reformation, wardens and rectors of this place were still composing for the first fruits and tenths. And that's because at the time of the Reformation, instead of giving the money back to the people who had paid it, the Crown held on to it. The Brits, again, held on to the money. And for a couple of centuries, the bishops of the Church of Ireland were determined to get their hands on the interest that had been accruing on the first fruits at the Exchequer in London, so that they could maintain churches like this and build new churches where they were needed. And they hadn't any luck. And then, out of the blue, they identified a very gifted young clergyman who was only a vicar in a very small parish in the Diocese of Meath, but who had very strong connections into the English administration. And his name was Jonathan Swift. And the bishops of the Church of Ireland sent Jonathan Swift over to London to negotiate the return of the first fruits to Ireland. And they sent with him, because he was very junior, they sent with him the Bishop of Limerick to give him a bit of seniority. But there's no mention of the Bishop of Limerick when he gets to London. He cleared off. He'd obviously gone to see Hamilton, not to anything else. He wasn't going to do any business when he was there. But Jonathan Swift successfully renegotiated the return of the first fruits to the Church of Ireland. And it was a remarkable piece of political negotiation. And he thought he would become a bishop in the English church because of his skill. He didn't even become a bishop in the Irish church, God help him. He became the Dean of St. Patrick's and was rather embittered by that experience at that time. But that money came and it established a body called the Board of First Fruits and Tenths. And nearly every church you'll see in the Church of Ireland, every crossroads, will have had a donation from the Board of First Fruits and Tenths to this building, just as this one had in the early 19th century to help maintain it. You'll also see in that timeline the name of someone who isn't particularly well remembered in Ireland, Oliver Cromwell, who in the south aisle of this parish preached the funeral sermon for one of his generals, Henry Jones. And Henry Jones' son went on to become the Bishop of Clogher in the Church of Ireland, a living connection. And Cromwell did what he did at every Anglican church in Ireland and England. He kicked out the rector. He kicked out the rector and he established a local preacher. And that local preacher was then ejected at the time of the restoration of the monarchy and episcopacy in Ireland and in England. That was in 1660. But in 1683, he's still hanging around York. He comes before a grand jury as a vagrant. It says, going about to seduce His Majesty's subjects under the pretense of religion. Churches go through phases: renewal, decline, revival. About 5 or 6 years ago, I was on holiday in Kent, in England, walking around the grounds of a very large estate. And I came across a little church on the estate. It was the estate church. And I went in to the church to have a look around. And I noticed that the vestry door was open, the sacristy door was open. And being nosy, I went in to have a look and see what was in there. And it's peculiar. If you go into a Catholic church anywhere, you'll almost always find a painting or a picture of the Pope. If you go into a Presbyterian church, you'll find a framed picture of John Calvin. If you go into a Methodist church, almost always an etching of John Wesley. And if you go into the vestry of an Anglican church, you'll always find a mirror. It's a very strange thing. But beside the mirror in the vestry was an etching of that church in about the year 1826. And in the etching there was a pulpit bolted against the wall. And in the pulpit was a very, very old clergyman preaching what was obviously a very, very long sermon. And you could see he was even bored himself. And bolted around the walls of the church were pews. And you could see bewildered villagers sitting in those pews. And in the great empty space in the middle of the church was one huge chair, armchair. And in it sat the unmistakable profile of the Duke of Wellington, fast asleep. It was the parish church on the estate which he had in Kent. And that's what was happening in churches all over these islands, particularly Anglican churches all over these islands. Church was a place to come to where there were very low expectations. God wasn't going to make a difference to your life or to the life of the world. It was just a place that you had to go to put in an hour. And then, in the 1830s, there arose a group of clergymen and a group of lay people who began to talk about the church. It was in the Anglican Church in England and Ireland. Began to talk about the church not as a department of state, not as a place that you went just to put another hour in, They began to talk about the church as God's eternal people. And they organised liturgy and they decorated church buildings so that people who came into them, came in through that door, would be immediately aware that this wasn't just any other place, that it was meant to be a foretaste of heaven. And they wanted to ensure that no one, not even the Duke of Wellington, would ever fall asleep again in church. They wanted to shake things up. They wanted to shake up the ruling class, because they revived the idea that the government and people with wealth had a special responsibility for the poor and for the alien, and for those who had been left aside. But of course the problem is that governments and people, you and me, don't really like being shaken up. And there was a fair bit of resistance to what they were attempting to do, called the Oxford Movement, the Church of England, Church of Ireland. But their legacy, in terms of sacramental worship and beauty, were soon mainstream, and they're still with us. And they're with us still, because despite all their ideas of lavish decoration and polyphonic music, their interior decoration principle was, I'll have another one of those, only bigger. But at the heart of what it was they were trying to do is they wanted to achieve a simple, Jesus-centered spirituality and piety. I mentioned in this year's General Synod that Bishop Paul has had the very good fortune to have ministered in the two great cities of this island, Cork and Belfast. And he will know of a parish church in North Belfast, which has a particularly large brass bookstand in the pulpit. And it's so large, it's made so large, so that the preacher, whoever he or she might be, their notes won't cover the inscription that goes round the edge of that brass bookstand. And the inscription, because it was the authorised version they were using in those days of that gospel reading which we had today, the inscription is what was asked by those Greek-speaking Jews as they were going up to the Feast of the Passover. Sir, we would see Jesus. Sir, we want to see Jesus. And it's a reminder to the preacher and to the church that that is our principal task, especially here. Not to argue, not to connive, not to show off, not to scold, not to condemn. Our vocation as priests, as bishops, as lay people, as disciples, is to allow people to see Jesus. That's why this building and this Christian community has been preserved in the providence of God in all its glory these 800 years. To hold up Jesus, to hold up his life, his cross, and his resurrection, so that a new generation can look on that beautiful face and respond to it in the way that his moral grandeur demands, by surrendering ourselves wholly to his love. There was in Jesus no guileless simplicity of nature. He was perfectly sure and self-sure, knowing his mind and carrying it through with an unparalleled energy. When he stood before the civil authorities near the end of his life, he knew he was hurrying on events on a world scale. He had a royal sense of himself, and yet he sat amongst children. He loved the religion of his people, and he had an intense reverence for the past, but it was too small for him, and he broke it down. Though it broke his own heart, he tore it apart. He was an austere man, and he could be a severe critic, especially towards those who misrepresented the character of his father. And for that reason, he ripped through the pedantry of the scribes, the scholars of his day, and he developed a simple pictorial way of speaking that brought his father close to the simplest of minds. He was patient, and he took nothing for granted. So he spent many nights alone on the cold mountain to search out his father's heart. He spoke with such power because he loved silence. Although he had a sacramental idea of all human relationships, especially the central relationship of marriage, he avoided for himself any tie of property or family or office. He was gentle to the last degree with all who were poor or alien or sick or who had been shot. And there's not a single instance in the Gospels of Jesus telling the mentally disturbed or the physically ill who crowded around him to reconcile themselves to their sufferings. Instead, he healed them. And all of this is more remarkable because he had such a short life in which to wrestle with the turbulence of his vast soul. And should this church stand for another 800 years, its task will remain the same: to allow all who come here to see Jesus, to know his presence in word and sacrament, and to know it as the most real thing in the whole world. And to be able to say, surely this is the house of God. Surely this is the gate of heaven. And then his glory will be seen in you all and in the land. So now on to him, who by the power at work within us is able to do far more abundantly than all we ask or think. To him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus unto all generations, forever and ever. Amen.